Alright guys, so welcome to our third class, and today we're talking mostly about the architecture of the Bronze Age in and around the Mediterranean, right? So we'll be looking at these three very distinct regions for this time period. First, at the beginning of class, we're going to have a look at the Aegean, so kind of modern day Greece and Turkey and the islands surrounding them. We're going to be looking at really the forefathers of ancient Greek culture here and their contributing architecture. And then towards the middle of class, we're going to be looking at Egypt. Specifically, we're going to be progressing to look at the New Kingdom Egypt and talking a lot about how, ancient Egyptian temples functioned. And then finally, towards the end of class, we're going to be talking about biblical Jerusalem and going over the early origins of the Jewish people and the first monotheistic architecture that they built at Jerusalem. So, a very important class today. I hope you learned something and enjoy. So let's begin with the Minoan civilization. So one of really the most extraordinary Bronze Age awakenings occurred in the island of Crete, and Crete is really the father, the parent of ancient Greek civilization. So in the Bronze Age, this small island in the middle of the Mediterranean, Crete, enjoyed this massive period of prosperity, this short period of prosperity really, from 1900 to 1600 BC. And Crete essentially had developed at this time the largest commercial fleets in the Mediterranean and kind of engaged in Mediterranean-wide trade, mostly with Egypt, ancient Turkey, and some of the eastern Mediterranean cities. And so the Minoans really developed some of the first proper cities on the Mediterranean islands, and their urban life was very vibrant with frescoes and geometric designs and vibrant colors painted on the plaster of their buildings, with Knossos here being their largest city, possibly housing up to 50,000 people. This civilization coming out of the middle of the Mediterranean to rival that of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and where they rivaled these great early civilizations was in their massive maritime trade, as I've said, but also in their religious complexes. These were a very, very religious people, and they built these massive temples. Their most massive and major religious complex, we believe, is also at Knossos, the biggest one that's been excavated at least, and it's often been associated by the later ancient Greeks with the Minotaur, because they would come upon these ruins of Minoan temples, and they seemed as if they were very complicated mazes to them. So, Crete is where the origin of the Minotaur in Greek myths is from, but actually these are, as I've said, massive temple complexes as we know them today, since they've been excavated and studied, and it's thought they were overseen by creeds of powerful priestesses. Notably, there were no kings in Crete during this period, so just like early Mesopotamia, the Minoans might have had a religious rule, a theocracy, if you will. And the last notable thing to note about the Minoans is, unlike many other ancient civilizations, they constructed their cities on these kind of naturally protected hillsides, but they did not build defensive walls around them. So, the absence of fortifications here suggests kind of a lack of internal conflicts, perhaps a unification of the inhabitants of the five major cities of ancient Crete, kind of braced against the world, but not needing to hunker down and fortify, not really fearing an invading army. So because they had the most advanced ships and by extension navy in the Mediterranean, the ocean served as their walls. So Minoan towns and cities were quite unique, and let's just quickly go over one of the best preserved examples of Minoan urban planning, and that is at Gornia on the island of Crete. And so here, in kind of representation of larger Minoan cities, there were only around 60 houses built, and they held a population of really fewer than 1,000. But the most striking thing about these towns, these cities, is they had such a tight network of narrow streets, despite being able to spread out. Not a lot of evidence for dwellings outside of these very densely packed towns and cities. And then, of course, at the hill's crest, at the highest point of these towns and cities, there was the prominent temple complex, and the main street always kind of extended from the temple area across the hill. And in this particular town, you also have these kind of intersecting alleys descending perpendicularly down flights of steps. And so here out into the living spaces, the houses were so close together, they often shared walls. So this will remind you of, yes, Çatalhöyük, but also the very close, densely populated Mesopotamian cities such as Ur. This might have, yes, been slightly defensive, but this might have also been to accommodate something very novel. Surprisingly, all of these small houses had indoor plumbing, quite a luxury in the Bronze Age. The plumbing system included stone drains that went through the streets and even flushable toilets, similar to what the Indus Valley had in the previous millennium. And this is really the first example of indoor plumbing we see around the Mediterranean and in the West in general. Now, as you can see in this very lovely artist depiction here, Minoan houses were decorated with plaster and designs like spirals and plants. They were very colorful, and we can tell this not only from remnants that survive on the ruins, but also these ceramic tiles that have been found in Minoan sites, especially in Knossos, which show these houses vibrantly painted. We're not sure what they're for, but they're very clear depictions of what used to be these fully built structures. But Minoan houses were essentially these kind of unique buildings with a lower stone story and an upper mud brick story supported by wooden braces to resist this common calamity in the Mediterranean that is earthquakes. So it's kind of needed that their houses are designed this way. And so people would have accessed the upper floors of these houses by these kind of outdoor staircases, while the lower part served as this cool and very protected storage unit. So you have these small towns like Gornia popping up everywhere on Crete, but what allowed these massive cities to develop on such a small island, this very advanced culture to develop on such a small island, and that was trade. So you had what would become these very successful merchant city-states like Knossos trading with the entire Mediterranean and eventually establishing colonies on the coast of Turkey and the other Greek islands. The Minoans developed clay turntables around 2000 BC, which kind of foreshadowed the potter's wheel, contributing to this massive ceramics industry, getting sort of a technological leg up on the rest of the Mediterranean, who made their pottery entirely in the old-fashioned spiral method. And this understandably led to massive commissions such as the labyrinth at Knossos, which was first built around 1900 BC, but was destroyed by an earthquake 2 centuries later, and then by a volcanic eruption in 1600 BC. But the final version that we have excavated today mostly comes from 1450 BC. And you'll notice this falls outside of the range of dates for this culture I gave at the beginning of class. But still in 1450 BC, Minoan culture is going strong. It's just ruled by the Mycenaeans, who we're going to talk about in a minute. But essentially, they were the other kind of forefathers of the ancient Greeks. So, in this period, we don't label it as the traditional Minoan period, but Minoans culturally are still in existence. They're just subjects of a more wide-ranging and successful culture now coming from mainland Greece. So let's talk about this temple here, the temple at Knossos, the most famous temple of the Minoans. And similar to palace temples in Mesopotamian cities, the Minoan temples collected agricultural tribute, collected grain, and controlled the grain supply back out to its citizens. So just like the very early Mesopotamians, specifically the Sumerians, we might define the Minoans as theocratic socialists, right? And kind of like Mesopotamian palaces as well, the Knossos temple had a very interesting defensive feature. It's very confusing layout, which you can see very plainly in this blueprint here. None of the 8 entry points into the temple provided direct access to the central court, where the primary rituals were probably carried out. The main entryway from the west porch led through this long corridor that took 2 right-angle turns before you even reached the central court. And so along this corridor, it's very well preserved, and you see these life-size paintings of these young people carrying sacrificial offerings, hinting at the temple's religious purpose. The central court at Knossos was this nearly perfect rectangular space, similar in size and proportions to the courts in other Minoan temples of the era, suggesting this shared ritual standard. This massive courtyard at the center was absolutely essential for the functions of the temples, which are kind of shady, kind of misty. We don't fully understand the functions of these courtyards, but the courtyard was in every Minoan temple this very central, very clearly important space. But we have a hint of what this courtyard was used from based on the frescoes. So, one of the fascinating parts of Knossos was what we call this bull court. We've named this central courtyard the bull court, likely used, we think, for this bull dance depicted in the famous Toreador fresco. And so you see here in this fresco, a young boy is helped by two female acrobats to flip over a bull. And so these temples featured stylized and sculpted bulls all over the place, with their horns serving even as decorative finials along the parapet. So something to do with possibly the sacrificing of a bull, possibly for agricultural abundance, was carried out frequently at these temples. In fact, enough to make the temple very much bull themed. On the western side of the temple, you had administrative functions because, again, these temples were the center of not just religion but government. So you had these storing granaries for storing essentially the tax in kind of the citizens. So the tax in grain of the citizens to redistribute out equally to the citizens, this kind of welfare program coming from the temples. And then in the northwestern quarter, you had things like workshops and bakeries for pilgrims. And then in the southeastern quarter, you had housing for the priestesses, it seems, the governing and ritual authorities of these Minoan cities. And finally, on the western side, near the north corner, you had the courtyard opening to what we've named the Throne Sanctuary. And the Throne Sanctuary was essentially this series of rooms with alabaster benches along the walls and porphyry basins in the center. This was likely a sanctuary for the high priestesses before they appeared in the bull court. Ceramic statues found here even depicted snake goddesses with exposed breasts holding snakes with an air of authority, suggesting, how the priestesses might have performed their kind of supernatural manifestations, presenting themselves possibly as goddesses when interacting with mortals. And a lot of study has gone into reconstructing the rituals of Minoan temples. And then finally, the rear elevations of the labyrinth contained these colonnaded loggias, these porches that open to the landscape, thought to be, a reception point for visitors or even ritual participants. This area might have included ritual bathing facilities for visitors, or perhaps it's theorized sacrificial victims even, before they were guided through the temple's winding corridors to the central court, possibly to be ritually sacrificed. But the thing to take away about Minoan temple architecture and city architecture, just in general, is the Minoans built their structures very incrementally, adapting, to the uneven terrain by incorporating features like windows, terraces, and loggias to connect with the surrounding landscape, to kind of draw you outside and blur the line between even outside and inside. This design philosophy conveyed this very joyful unity with nature. And this was an architectural concept, an architectural philosophy the ancient Greeks would later adopt, as you might be beginning to see similarities between ancient Greek architecture and the much earlier Minoan architecture. The majority of the very harmonious, very beautiful architecture of the ancient Greeks was definitely derived mostly from the Minoans, and definitely mostly not the Mycenaeans, the other forefathers of Greek culture, who I just mentioned a couple minutes ago, who had a very pragmatic and almost militaristic type of architecture. And so we're going to talk about them right now. So essentially, Mycenaean civilization was the last phase of the Bronze Age in ancient Greece, really spanning the period from around 1750 to 1050 BC. And so the Mycenaeans were these mainland Greek peoples, these people coming from mainland Greece who were probably stimulated from contact with Minoan Crete, and developed a culture of their own, very much more of a masculine warrior culture centered around fealty to their kings, who they called Warnaks. This was the historical setting of much of ancient Greek literature and mythology, including, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Trojan War. This is what the ancient Greeks are writing about when they talk about these long ancient times, this Mycenaean civilization, this forebear to what we know and understand as traditional classic ancient Greece. So, the great cities, the great citadels of these Mycenaean kings were built around 1400 to 1250 BC at the height of Mycenaean power. And so these fortresses were very cleverly located on defensible hills with typically a reliable water supply, a stream running through the citadel. Mycenae, one of the most famous of these cities, the city that the entire culture is named after, is very famous for its cyclopean walls made of these massive boulders, expertly, fit together without the use of mortar. Around 1250 BC, they even added more walls with boulders weighing up to 5 tons each. So, these impressive walls protected the houses of the elite and provided, shelter for the population during dangerous times, since most of the king's subjects would have lived outside the walls on nearby slopes, right? So, while Mycenaean architecture borrowed some artistic elements from Crete, like the artistic decoration, like the frequent use of columns, their style was quite different at its core. Mycenaean buildings were made mostly of stone, emphasizing solidity, hierarchy, and defense. These cities, as I said, were all strategically perched on, these steep outcroppings, these steep hills, and fortified with very thick walls, because this was a land made up of these city-states ruled by constantly warring kings, very unlike the Minoans. And also unlike the Minoans, Mycenaean houses were very small, very windowless, and they didn't really connect much with the outside world, with nature. Instead of conveying a sort of blurring between inside and outside, their artistic intentions often, evoked a sense of dread and over defensiveness, because this was such a war-torn culture. One of the most notable features surviving in these city walls still is what's known as the Lion's Gate, this primary entrance to the citadel of Mycenae. So it's built along with a new round of city walls, and the gate is made up of monoliths, just like the construction of, say, Stonehenge. It's got this massive triangular lintel weighing around 25 tons with these protective lions, right? And then, as you see in this reconstruction, the gate is surrounded by what's called a bastion, offering this kind of broad firing platform for defenders to target intruders, specifically from their unshielded right sides. So you would have had besiegers marching up, trying to knock down at the front gate of Mycenae, really the only public entrance to the city. Meanwhile, you would have had defenders from this bastion firing down at the right sides of soldiers. Most people are right-handed, so their shields would have, if you can imagine, be in their left hands. Just a little bit of expert defense engineering from the Mycenaeans. So these Mycenaean hilltop cities and towns typically featured these heavily fortified, what's called megarons, at the center, or these great halls built by feudal lords as their sort of audience chambers. One well-documented example of this type is located in Pylos, about 66 miles southwest of Mycenae. Most Mycenaean royal halls, to start, faced south, and guards likely stood in this specifically made vestibule between the porch and the inner audience hall. And then at the heart of these halls, in the audience hall, was this massive circular hearth in every single one we find pretty much raised on a step and paved with stuccoed clay. And then 4 posts formed this essentially square around the hearth, supporting these clerestory openings in the roof to let natural light in and allow smoke from the hearth to escape. Then the royal throne was positioned against typically the eastern wall and flanked by painted griffins, these guardians of the king. And then the rest of the walls were adorned with frescoes depicting, say, musicians, hunts, soldier shields, and abstract patterns. This was a very masculine art piece, these very masculine murals depicting, the lavish yet insecure and war-torn lifestyles of these ancient Mycenaean nobles and kings. While the exteriors of the Megarons were typically clad with these very finely cut, very precious limestone, the walls themselves were typically constructed on the inside using rubble and reinforced with a frame of horizontal and vertical timber. So although these Megarons appeared to be built entirely of stone, this wasn't the case. Typically, kings made it seem like they were much more expensive on the outside than the structural truth on the inside. This practice of covering inferior construction materials with a thin veneer of stone or sometimes alabaster likely originated from the Minoans, creating this false sense of opulence. So this Megaron design actually later influenced the layout of classical Greek temples, traditional ancient Greek temples, and some Megarons were even converted into Greek temples in the ancient Greek era, the classical Greek era. So we've talked about the citadels of the Mycenaeans, we've talked about the assembly halls of their kings, and now finally let's talk about their tombs, specifically their most impressive and long-standing tombs, the tombs of their kings. So these are called Tholos tombs, and Tholos tombs were these impressive conical corbel vaulted structures built during really the last century of Mycenaean power, when the Mycenaean kings were at their greatest in wealth. So these tombs were somewhat like the prehistoric cairns we talked about a couple classes ago. So, the builders constructed this corbelled dome and covered it with earth for stability, carving out a stone-aligned entry into the entrance, a lot like the prehistoric cairns. But the burial ceremony is one of the most interesting burial ceremonies in the Bronze Age, in Bronze Age Europe. And I think you will be very surprised at the extent that subjects and vassals went to honor their dead kings. So for the burial ceremony, a funeral procession essentially carried the body of the king and usually his queen, who was expected to commit suicide, to be buried with her husband, and possibly also a few attendants, some of whom might have sacrificed themselves to be buried with their lord. And so the king was placed in a grave pit beneath the chamber's floor, along with his sacrificed attendants, and surrounded by valuable treasures like bronze daggers, precious dining ware, jewelry, even clay pots filled with food and drink for the afterlife. The same idea as with the ancient Egyptians, giving the king things he would need to rule in the afterlife. And then after all of these riches were piled on, logs were essentially stacked over the pit to form a pyre, which was then lit on fire. And so as the pyre burned, it collapsed into the grave pit. And then the mourners finally covered the bodies with earth and placed large stone slabs over the grave. They then sealed the tomb entrance and sacrificed horses in the causeway before filling it too with earth. The idea is that the king will be able to ride a chariot into the spiritual realm, into the afterlife in style here. So having covered, all notable aspects of Mycenaean architecture, in the late 1200s BC, all of these Mycenaean cities and Aegean settlements in general faced some kind of decline and destruction, probably due to kind of a mix of internal uprising and also invasions from the mysterious Sea People. So the Sea People were essentially this group of mysterious naval raiders who essentially wreaked havoc across the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age, around the 12th century BC. No one knows exactly where they came from, but they seem to be a mix of different groups from various Mediterranean regions. And these invaders are, often blamed for the widespread chaos and collapse of several ancient civilizations, including the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and New Kingdom Egypt, which we're going to talk about later. Their attacks played a big role in the downfall of these once great societies during the Bronze Age collapse, but obviously they're still being studied and theorized about. It's unclear just how much they contributed to the Bronze Age collapse and the true impetus was. It could have been the Sea Peoples, it could have been climate change, it could have been a number of theories, which I would I would happily go over in a different class on ancient civilizations. But essentially, in a desperate search for sustenance, for peace, the Mycenaeans may have attacked other towns, leading to this kind of slow decline marked by famine and warfare in this period. And we're going to see this is how every civilization that we're going to talk about in this class eventually declined at the end of the Bronze Age. But back at the height of the Bronze Age, the people of the Aegean, including the Mycenaeans, had these cultural roots tracing essentially back to Turkey, and they maintained strong ties with what became the powerful Hittite Empire, which was at its peak around the same time as Mycenae's Golden Age, from around 1600 to 1200 BC. This connection really strongly suggests the Mycenaeans may have originated from the Hittites, sharing in their rise and influence during this period, and the Hittites are the second kind of culture we're going to talk about today in this class. What really catapulted the Hittites into mainstream historical knowledge was back in the 1800s. Archaeologists began excavating Troy, yes, the famous city of Troy, from the famous legend of the Trojan War. And so Troy was once a Hittite possession, and the excavation of this city really proved to highlight these striking cultural and archaeological similarities on both sides of the Aegean, highlighting the connections between these ancient cultures of the Hittites and the Mycenaeans. They were very, very similar. Back in the 1800s, when excavators discovered layers of settlements in this city, they dated all the way from 1800 to 1100 BC, which this illustration kind of shows these superimposed layers of occupation. And unlike Mycenae, the giant kind of capital of the Mycenaeans, Troy was much smaller, housing just a few thousand people within its walls, with many more living outside. But like other Mycenaean cities, Troy had this upper fortress with thick walls and a Megaron at the center, at the very top of the city, the king's assembly hall, right? Just like the Mycenaeans. So it's clear already that the Hittites had a very similar political system as the Mycenaeans. This very masculine warrior culture, again centered around fealty to their kings, centered around kingly city-states. So let's talk about Hattusha, the heart of the Hittite Empire. So the Hittites were very smart about where they built their towns, choosing elevated spots for defensive reasons, like on hills. They really went all out with their construction, impressive fortifications, paved streets, monumental public buildings, and even an efficient drainage system throughout the city. So Hattusha, their capital, was the prime example of the height of construction and engineering that the Hittites could achieve, and it was positioned at the end of a valley on a rocky outcrop, and it served as essentially the major military base and hub for their supply and tribute network, which stretched all the way to Mesopotamia. Initially, the city was about the same size as Mycenae. The city's citadel, the kind of city within the city which housed the king and his courtiers, and the Megaron, the king's assembly hall at the center of the city, was protected by its own walls and sat on the northern highest slope of the city, giving a very commanding view of the valley. And the Hittites who built the city made very clever use of the natural terrain here for defense, reinforcing it with these huge unfinished boulders that kind of blended in seamlessly with the landscape, and kind of gave a besieging army only one way to get to the citadel, only one way forward, where they could be kind of picked off by archers and soldiers. Around 1400 BC, the Hittites beefed up their defenses by extending their walls on the vulnerable southern side, and this made Hattusha comparable in size to major Mesopotamian cities like Ur, and even population-wise eventually. They skillfully combined these thick 10-meter wide boulders at the base with lighter mud bricks on the top of the walls, so they could use a lot less stone but still have the imposingness and the defensive values of these elevated walls. And then guard towers were placed about every 30 meters, functioning as these security checkpoints, and they even dug a ditch and piled up dirt to make it tough for attackers to attack from the south. The Hittites were also very notably sneaky in their siege defense tactics, using secret tunnels for surprise attacks during sieges. Their innovative construction methods probably had a big impact on Mycenaean building styles. As Hattusha developed and its population expanded, its residential areas became quite Middle Eastern in style, so a lot like the courtyard houses in Ur. Imagine houses around 5 or 6 rooms grouped around these cozy little courtyards. The wealth from this empire kind of allowed a lot of its residents, at least within the walls, to live in these kind of grand, almost lavish-like houses. The streets may have looked chaotic, kind of like Ur, but they were surprisingly advanced, featuring covered drains for a sort of outgoing sewage system to keep things clean. And then Hattusha's citadel for the king was very spacious, a bit larger than the labyrinth at Knossos, but sort of the same architecture. 2 courtyards lined with columns, a maze of warehouses for storing taxes in kind, and a hypostyle hall. Around 12,000 BC, though, despite its military strength and formidable fortifications, Hattusa, just like Mycenae and Knossos, experienced a collapse of its culture. And it's thought that famine set about from perhaps the arrival of the sea peoples contributed to their downfall as well. So picking up where we left off in Egypt from last class with the Middle Kingdom Egypt, we don't really have that much to say architecturally about the Middle Kingdom. And in the 18th to 16th centuries BC, Egypt ran into a major problem with an invading people, the Hyksos, this group of outsider who the Egyptians called shepherd kings from the kind of Palestinian regions. These guys managed to take over Egypt and even started ruling as pharaohs. Now, it's theorized that these Hyksos originally came from the steppe as pastoralists, so people herding goats and sheep and domesticating horses and using them to pull war chariots. Traditionally, the steppe can field massive civilization collapsing armies, and this is maybe the first result we see of it. But in any case, the Hyksos came to Egypt with some serious military upgrades, which is why they were able to cut through Middle Kingdom Egypt like butter. They brought horses, chariots, a well-trained army picked up probably from their time on the steppe. And they ruled Egypt for around 108 years. But eventually Thutmose I stepped in and kicked the Hyksos out, restoring indigenous Egyptian rule and kicking off the New Kingdom period, which we're going to talk about today. So Tutmosis I took charge in Thebes after kicking out the Hyksos, and during and after his reign, Egypt expanded its dominion all the way north to the Euphrates and all the way south to Nubia. In the city of Thebes, the traditional cult of Ammon, king of the gods, thereafter became the capital of Egypt, the political and religious center of the whole nation, and the Ammon cult merged here with the cult of Ra, the sun god, to form a new god called Amun-Ra. It was believed this god was truly in charge of keeping Egypt a paradise. So pharaohs sent to Thebes significant tributes in gold and other spoils from conquered lands, and the wealth was used to construct grander and grander temples here until they were so big and complicated that people today would have to devote their lives to studying how they worked. So Thebes in the New Kingdom thrived and expanded along the banks of the Nile. It had these two major temple compounds, Karnak to the north and Luxor to the south, each enclosed by mud brick walls. And then this 2.5-mile avenue of ram-headed sphinxes connected the two temples as this major artery running through the city. And then palaces and administrative buildings were located between the two temples. And so the annual Opet festival, dedicated to the fertility of all the gods, involved carrying the statues of Ammon, Mut, and Khonsu, essentially the royal family of all the gods, in boats between the temples. And the temple complexes had these large priesthoods, employed thousands of workers, and owned extensive estates, including cattle, orchards, boats, fields, and workshops. And just to add to the image, to the picture of New Kingdom Thebes I'm painting for you right now, you can imagine at this point across the Nile on the side of the dead, the western side, there were many more rock-cut mortuary temples of pharaohs, now covering about 6 miles from Deir el-Bahri, housing the tombs of the Middle and now New Kingdom pharaohs, increasing in number as the New Kingdom stretches on. So most Theban citizens lived along this west bank of the Nile between the river and the line of temples, and although many Theban homes are gone now from the ancient Egyptian period, obviously people still live in Thebes, and they've been replaced and replaced again by successive architecture. We can piece together their design from drawings and digs elsewhere. So typical Theban homes were kind of like the modern townhouses we know today. They typically had small courtyards on both sides, and they were all oriented north and south to allow for the north-south breeze to flow through. And the main living area in Theban houses was this spacious central hall. And then at the back of the house, there was typically kind of a kitchen with a staircase that led to second floor bedrooms and a rooftop terrace. You know, the central living room typically had this higher ceiling than the side rooms, allowing for kind of natural light to permeate through clerestory windows high up just below the roof. And even richer families had these dugout basements to store grains and belongings. You know, we think these houses were often painted very colorfully with these typically fancy palm frond decorations. But this was the middle class to upper middle class that lived in the cities. If you were very wealthy, typically you would build a villa out in the countryside to get away from the hustle and bustle of the cities. So on the edges of towns and in the surrounding countryside, you would find aristocratic villas which had their own gardens, their own pools, their own granaries, and their own stables. They could really spread out. They didn't have to build such constricted, narrow townhouses. They could really build entire estates as miniature versions of the pharaoh's palace. So while the houses and palaces of Thebes were built of mud and other expendable materials, Egyptian temples used solid limestone and have endured even today as ruins. So the commanding monument of Thebes in all of Egypt was its massive temple complexes, as I said, notably the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, a massive walled-in city of religion within the city of Thebes. And so pilgrims essentially flocked here from all over New Kingdom Egypt to hand over offerings in the form of foodstuffs and money to priests in its colonnaded courts, who took them in, offered them to the gods, and then put them to good use, funding their lifestyles and feeding their employees. So the Temple of Amun-Ra boasted the greatest endowment of any institution in Egypt, owning essentially 583,000 acres of farms and the labor of around 83,000 peasants, rivaling even the power of the pharaoh. Most importantly, it housed the three great temples for the three members of the holy family of gods, the most important gods in Egypt at the time: Amun-Ra, the new king of the gods, his wife Mut, and his son Khonsu. And then paths lined with sphinxes connected each of these temples to one another. Perhaps the most striking aspects about these temples are the imposing pylons, these kind of gateways marking holier and holier spaces as you get closer to the temple. But the linear alignment of multiple pylons on the way to the pathways to these temples essentially symbolized for the New Kingdom Egyptians the Nile's path through this cliff-lined valley, So it is essentially a symbolized reproduction of the cliffs surrounding the Nile. And so this was actually to accommodate a ritual where the priests carried longboats, mini longboats, with effigies of wooden gods on their shoulders from temple to temple, so the gods could symbolically visit one another and converse. The maintenance of the gods themselves in ancient Egyptian religion was directly maintained by their worshippers, by this priestly class. Without the priestly class maintaining the happiness of the gods, Egypt would be overtaken by calamity and apocalypse. But this was not the only use of these famous pylons. Karnak Temple was a favorite among New Kingdom pharaohs, who generously supported and frequented it because its pylons and obelisks were great places to engrave their achievements as propaganda to bolster their rule, since everyone in Egypt frequently made pilgrimages here. Pylons were then essentially a billboard for successive pharaohs to depict their military exploits and write all the achievements of their rule in hieroglyphs. So typically each pharaoh would add a pylon to one of these temple complexes at Thebes. And each temple followed the traditional Egyptian layout, featuring this central access that began with an impressive colonnaded entry court that made you feel small and in the presence of a god, leading visitors into a grand hypostyle hall to make offerings, which ultimately priests would take to a more restricted inner sanctum, featuring the sacred boat and the wooden or gold idol of the god as an effigy. Within the temple walls of Amun-Ra at Karnak, you could actually find 12 smaller temples honoring different deities and pharaohs representing the diverse Egyptian pantheon. So this was not just a center for the royal family of gods, this was a center for much, much more of the Egyptian pantheon over time. And so as Karnak's temple power grew, it became the coronation site for pharaohs. And so in the New Kingdom, the priests had really eventually taken control of much of the land, labor, and people of New Kingdom Egypt, while the pharaohs increasingly served a more military and symbolic role. You might compare this to the sort of rule and power of the Vatican at Rome compared to the successive dynasties that ruled that region of Italy in the medieval period. The Temple of Amun-Ra here is essentially the Vatican of ancient Egypt, holding all of the religious power, most of the political power, and most of the wealth. Now let's switch gears and look at the new funerary monuments coming out of the New Kingdom on the other side of the Nile for the pharaohs. Now we've seen this picture before. Last lecture we were talking about the rock-cut tomb of Mentuhotep, and next to it was this much better preserved rock-cut tomb. This belongs to Hatshepsut, and Hatshepsut was the first historically documented woman to rule Egypt with the full authority typically held by a male pharaoh. So Hatshepsut, this queen who adopted the title of pharaoh, reigned over a mostly peaceful Egypt for 21 years, spanning from around 1479 to 1458 BC, and she was very significant and artistically influential to Karnak, leaving the most lasting mark out of all of the pharaohs on the temple complex. So how did a woman such as Hatshepsut end up inheriting the very unlikely title of Pharaoh of all of New Kingdom Egypt? You know, up until this point, every single pharaoh was male. So Hatshepsut is actually the daughter of Thutmose I, that pharaoh we talked about at the beginning of our discussion on ancient Egypt today, on New Kingdom Egypt today, who drove out the Hyksos and established the New Kingdom. And so while her father Thutmose I was ruling New Kingdom Egypt, Hatshepsut had married her half-brother Thutmose II, following the kind of typical royal practice of preserving bloodlines through incestuous marriages. This is very common for ancient Egyptian dynasties. But her father would die, her brother Thutmose II would become pharaoh, and after her brother's death, Hatshepsut would become regent for the next in line for the throne, her infant nephew and stepson Thutmose III, who was born of a concubine. Now, because this infant was born of a concubine, his right to rule was very weak, half as strong as Hatshepsut herself, who had fully royal blood. And so, before this infant even grew old enough to become pharaoh, Hatshepsut, with a team of supporters, orchestrated a bloodless coup and crowned herself pharaoh, taking on all the traditional male attributes of power. And to keep her position, she heaped riches and construction projects on the temples at Karnak, the real power holders in Egypt. She also presented herself as divine, the daughter of Ammon and a prophetess. She used architecture as propaganda to spread these claims, building 5 major temple complexes throughout Egypt, covered in propaganda, depicting herself as a prophetess and a demigod. But let's talk about this work up on the slide here, her most lasting contribution to the current archaeological landscape of Egypt, her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. So while overseeing some construction projects at Karnak Temple, Hatshepsut was also on the other side of the Nile, managing the burials of her father and husband in the Valley of Kings. And she started her most ambitious project, this terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, initially intended for her father, but later for her and named after her. And as you can no doubt tell, Hatshepsut's temple was very much inspired by the earlier structure to the left, built by Mentuhotep, which we talked about in the last class, but this one was 3 times larger and much more intricately designed. In the New Kingdom, really starting with Hatshepsut, the actual tomb sites were actually located on the other side of the cliffs, deep within what's called the Valley of Kings. So these were symbolic tombs and actual temple sites for worshipping the dead pharaohs. Hatshepsut's temple also played a role in what's called the annual Feast of the Valley, where, as I said before, the statue of the god Ammon would visit the mortuary temples of the earthly pharaohs across the Nile on the Nile's west bank, carried over by priests from the Karnak temple complex to convene and converse with the deceased pharaohs. You know, the approach to her temple featured, like Mentuhotep's, this very wide causeway, this very wide road lined with hundreds of sandstone sphinxes, leading to a grand pylon gate and 3 terrace levels behind it. You know, granite sphinxes with Hatshepsut's face lined the path to the first and second terraces, connected by these gradual ramps, just like Mentuhotep's monument. And the upper terrace, the final level, boasted these 26 colossal statues of Osiris with Hatshepsut's face. Though Thutmose III, Hatshepsut's nephew, born of a concubine, later grew up, inherited the position of pharaoh, and defaced them after her death, he wanted to completely erase this memory of the woman who had deprived him of his inheritance for so many years. But getting back to the architecture, so the procession through this temple would have finally ended at a narrow chapel inside the base of the cliff dedicated to Amun, the chief god of the gods in ancient Egypt. There were also two smaller chapels built, one for Hatshepsut, for parishioners to pray to Hatshepsut, another for her father and her husband, located south of the main chapel, and here the statue of Amun would be left to commune with the spirits of the deceased pharaohs. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple was designed essentially and aesthetically to be this earthly paradise for the god Amun to reside in, meant to resemble the mythical homelands of the gods, which the ancient Egyptians called Punt. She even organized an expedition down to the Red Sea to search for the legendary Punt, the legendary homeland of the gods, and instead found a myriad of myrrh trees and brought them back, uprooted them, and planted them in the temple's gardens to adorn the temple's gardens. And so the temple, you can imagine, would have once had this cool and fragrant atmosphere full of lush gardens, full of myrrh trees and small pools to bathe in. And this very story of Hatshepsut's expedition to the Red Sea is depicted on the colonnade walls of the second terrace, situated between the chapels of Anubis and Hathor. And Hathor, the mother goddess, is often depicted with cow ears and had her likeness represented on the chapel's column capitals, shaped like her head. These are some of the most famous pieces of art that still survive in Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. Hatshepsut's stepson Thutmose III, who she brushed aside in his youth in order to become pharaoh, became her co-ruler when he came of age, and he didn't really show her much hostility during her lifetime, it seems, but after her death, when Thutmose III finally, after all these years waiting for his aunt's death, inherited his promised position as pharaoh, ordered the destruction of all of her monuments east of the Nile and erased her name and face, actually chiseled them out all across Egypt. And Thutmose III himself focused on, instead, military expansion, leading successful campaigns in Mesopotamia and Syria, and he continued to add to the Karnak complex and remodeled all of Hatshepsut's contributions in an attempt to erase her forever from the memory of Egypt. I want to show you, after the reign of Hatshepsut, just how temples tended to grow in one direction in the New Kingdom period in Egypt. So here's a great example to look at: the Temple of Luxor. The Temple of Luxor, initiated by Hatshepsut, started as a small granite temple in 1470 BC. Amenhotep III, a successor of Thutmose III, expanded it significantly, as did his eventual successor Ramses II to the west, and finally Nectanebo I. But you can see just how many pharaohs added to this, starting from the back with the functional portion of the temple and aggrandizing it by adding on to the front through the centuries, adding hypostyle halls, open colonnades, pylons, obelisks, priest houses, offices, storerooms, granaries, pools, and other smaller temples. So in this way, New Kingdom temples typically grew outward from the inner sanctum, usually in one direction, as greater and greater architectural entrances are provided, as well as amenities to support the priestly staff managing the temple. So for generations, pharaohs and priests had worked in harmony to benefit the people, but the cult of Amun was now threatening to fully eclipse the pharaoh's power. So the next pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, had other ideas, blasphemous ones. He ordered the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak stormed. The idol of the god was confiscated and the cult was shut down. Amenhotep IV introduced a new monotheistic religion centered on the sun god Aten, and the royal class were required to follow him, and the populace strongly encouraged. Amenhotep IV then changed his name to Akhenaten and established a new capital named after him to distance himself from the more conservative religious elite. His monotheism, as you can imagine, was seen as very heretical in a state traditionally under Amun-Ra's protection. Many thought Egypt would cease to be a paradise if the pharaoh himself abandoned the traditional gods. So in his new city, Akhenaten designed the Great Temple of Aten as a long, narrow structure within a walled compound, very comparable in size to Karnak, but the temple consisted of 6 open-air courts with 365 altars for the sun, one for every day of the year. And instead of an effigy of a god in the inner sanctum of the temple, it focused solely on a reflective solar disk, a symbol for the sun god. After Akhenaten's death, his son Tutankhamun, the famous King Tut, was pressured to restore the cult of Amun-Ra at Karnak, and so Akhenaten was completely destroyed and its temple fragments were repurposed for other projects. References to Akhenaten were erased to bolster the temple's former power, and so this brief challenge to religious norms led to the most intense, renewed, and vigorous patronage at Luxor and Karnak. A generation later, Ramses II, one of the most successful New Kingdom pharaohs, succeeded as the greatest contributor to these cult sites and really helped revive Egyptian confidence in their national rituals and religion again. One of his most recognizable contributions was erecting a colossal entry pylon at Karnak featuring seated colossi of himself. And so the entry to the new court was lined with sphinxes and adorned with friezes celebrating his recent victory over the Hittites. The Hittites, funnily enough, actually claimed they had won too, but whatever the outcome, he used it as propaganda to bolster his political standing with his citizens. And during his nearly 70-year reign, Ramses II even built grand temples in Nubia to showcase Egypt's power to these new Egyptian subjects. At Abu Simbel, he carved colossal statues of himself into the rock, and these temples were dedicated to the worship of him while he still lived. Ramses is even depicted in these temples worshiping himself, highlighting the belief that he was truly divine and truly carried perhaps the most massive ego of all the pharaohs. But despite his expressions of power, Egypt entered a period of decline just after his reign, characterized again by internal conflicts and invasions by the Sea Peoples starting around 1200 BC. The grand architectural traditions of Egypt then gradually faded as the power of the pharaohs shifted to the priestly class. So finally, we arrive at our last Bronze Age culture to look at today, and that is biblical Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is one of the oldest cities in the world that's been continuously inhabited, and it owes much of its fame, as I'm sure you're well aware, to its sacred status among the Jewish people. The Canaanites originally first settled there around 1800 BC, and since being taken over by the Jewish people, it's been through a lot. 17 very destructive sieges and rule by 25 different peoples. But like Hattusha, Jerusalem was originally perched on a defensible rocky site in the hills, and it's surrounded by desert to its east and lush valleys sloping down toward the Mediterranean to its west. And even though it doesn't have a river running through it, it relies entirely on a well, just highlighting how much Jerusalem's significance is deeply tied to its religious importance, despite it not being a very pragmatic, very logical place to build a city. Now let me just quickly go over the history of the Jewish people up until their refoundation of Jerusalem as it's currently understood by comparative analysis of the Torah, their holy book, with historical records and archaeology. So the Jewish people essentially started as these nomadic pastoralists during the Bronze Age who have their history told through their Torah's 5 books, their holy books. And essentially the 12 tribes of Israel came to believe in one invisible invisible God who communicated through prophets, through members of their tribes. And ancient Judaism was very unique in the sense that they had one God, and they prohibited any representation of this God, even avoiding uttering his name, Yahweh, often substituting it with the Lord. And a reoccurring theme in biblical stories, in stories of the Torah, is the Jewish people's struggle to remain devoted to this unseen deity. So their story begins with their first prophet named Abraham, who led his people from Ur to the Mediterranean during a drought at the end of the 3rd millennium BC. And as far as historical documents go, the next time we see them is in Egypt during the reign of Ramses II, and this may correlate with their tribe's documentation as slaves in Egypt in the Torah. And there's some debate about whether the Jews were actually part of the Semitic Hyksos invaders of northern Egypt in the 16th century BC, but it's well documented that they served the Egyptian state in construction projects during Ramses II's reign. And then around 12,000 BC, because of the regional upheaval, the collapse of the Bronze Age caused by probably the Sea Peoples and a lot of other factors, the Jewish people managed to escape Egypt and resettled in Canaan, conquering many towns. But right after their escape from Egypt, the tribes had their most important spiritual awakening, where they directly experienced their God as a pillar of fire, and through this new prophet, Moses received 10 commandments from him. So during this nomadic time, possibly 40 years, the tribes honored a mobile sanctuary called the Ark of the Covenant, and this ark housed the 10 commandments given to Moses, and God was believed to be present between the very wings of the cherubim on its lid. And so the ark was portable and frequently moved between different tribes for short periods at this time. So what led to the reestablishment of Jerusalem under the Jewish people itself? So really around 1000 BC, the Jews were under constant threat from the Philistines, these people that were likely descendants from the formidable Sea Peoples kind of fighting over the region of Canaan. And this danger actually united them under the fierce and strategic warrior king David. And David chose Jerusalem as their new capital, boldly ousting the resident Jebusites. And David's capital wasn't just any city, it was perched atop an oval-shaped fortified hill incorporating the very robust Jebusite fortification, so it was a very prized location to steal. Interestingly, the Jebusites were peacefully integrated into the city's fabric, and the layout of New Jerusalem echoed the grandeur of Mycenaean citadels, with the elites living within the protective walls while most people lived in the surrounding villages. And they even had a secret tunnel system under the walls, providing a lifeline to external water sources, just like Hittite and Mycenaean fortresses. So what does this all tell us? This tells us really that the Jewish people at this time were rebranding themselves much like the Mycenaeans and Hittites, a fierce warrior culture centered around fealty to their kings, and now they're very interested in locking down Jerusalem as their Hattusha. So under David's new leadership, the Jews transformed from insignificant outsiders to really this regional powerhouse, exerting influence all the way from the Red Sea to the Euphrates River. And David understood the need for now a grand palace to legitimize his new dynasty, as well as a magnificent temple complex as the divine dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant, securing their spiritual and political dominance. And so King David established this stable religious center on a hill to the north of his city, breaking away from the tradition of moving the Ark of the Covenant between tribes. He placed it now for the first time in history in a permanent sanctuary. The first temple of the Jews was started by King David. And this bold move actually came from a divine revelation. the prophet Nathan delivered this message to David along with, detailed instructions on the temple's design and proportions. So this wasn't just city planning, it was divine mandate, and David executed it with the faith that their God would eternally protect this now holy city. David's son, King Solomon, fulfilled the mission of building the temple shortly after his assumption of power in 961 BC, and this first temple is popularly known as just the first temple, or sometimes you'll hear people call it Solomon's temple. And the first temple expanded to include a vast palace complex situated on the slope beneath the Temple Mount, the platform that the temple was built on. Jerusalem developed into a very political and religious center featuring grand hypostyle palace halls, residential courtyards, and even a separate harem quarter where Solomon's 700 wives were said to have lived. So let's zoom into this first temple, Solomon's temple, and talk about it. Now, this temple is described in detail in the Torah and also a few other sources, so we're able to sort of reconstruct it, but do take these reconstructions with a grain of salt. Not a lot of the archaeology of the first temple survives, but like Mesopotamian and Egyptian temples, the Jewish temples consisted of this rectangular precinct formed by the walls of its storerooms, and the outer court here was accessible to all of the Jewish people, while only the priesthood could really enter the inner court, which contained essentially an outdoor altar for burnt sacrifices and a bronze basin for purification, supported by these 12 sculpted oxen. If you want to learn more about the certain rituals surrounding this temple, you can read Kings and Chronicles in the Torah or the Old Testament. But outside literary sources describe this first temple as essentially a narrow oblong structure situated on a tall platform which only could be accessed by the religious elite via a frontal stairway. And the porch facade was said to feature 2 columns with these lily-shaped capitals, these very unique lily-shaped capitals. The main hall inside, we know, was adorned with these intricately carved cedar panels, and in the rear sanctuary known as the Holy of Holies, it was a perfect cube elevated a step above the rest of the temple. Unlike the many contemporary temples around the Near East at the time, this temple did not contain a statue of the god. Instead, it housed, you guessed it, the Ark of the Covenant. It was, though, believed that the Jewish God's presence resided within the Holy of Holies itself, so much so that annually during the Day of the Atonement feast, the high priest actually entered the Holy of Holies alone to perform sacrifices for the sins of all the Jewish people. A rope would even be tied around his waist so that if he were to die or faint during this very sacred experience, others could pull him back into the main hall without having to enter the Holy of Holies themselves. In 586 BC, though, Jerusalem was conquered by the first of its overlords, the Neo-Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar, resulting in the complete destruction of the first temple. And this event actually marks the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, with much of the Jewish people abandoning the region of Canaan and spreading out very widely again over the Near East. Many Jews actually attributed the city's architectural vanity to its downfall, seen as sort of hubris and a loss of their original nomadic values. So in addition to being taken as slaves back to Babylon, many Jews simply wanted to escape the vanity of Jerusalem. So would the Jewish people build a second temple? Yes, they would. Despite objections from the prophet Jeremiah, the construction of the second temple commenced around 535 BC, following permission from the Persians for the Jews to return to Jerusalem under the overlordship, under the governance of a Persian appointed governor. And this second temple, as described in the Bible, was initially a very relatively modest building, and there are known depictions or descriptions of its appearance. But in the late 1st century BC, probably around 20 BC if the New Testament is to be believed, King Herod I embarked upon an ambitious project to completely rebuild the second temple, and this is what you see before you on this beautiful reconstruction on this slide here. It's still called the second temple traditionally, even though it's really the third temple, but it's kind of this sly rebuilding of the second temple, so we call it the second temple still. And the Jews were ruled by the Romans at this time, and so it was supported by Roman protection and kind of influenced by Roman architecture, which you'll see a little bit later. But Herod essentially transformed the Temple Hill into the world's largest Temple Mount, and this Temple Mount still survives today. The base of the mountain was raised 30 meters into the air, creating this immense platform enclosed by a massive colonnaded perimeter like a Roman forum with 4 columns deep. And to ensure the sanctity of the holy site and allow religious rituals to continue during its construction, Herod trained 1,000 priests to work exclusively as masons. So priests built this temple. Normal, everyday run-of-the-mill stonemasons could not enter the sacred grounds, so priests had to build the temple itself. But sadly, this temple stood for only 90 years. The Roman Empire actually completely leveled this temple after a Jewish revolt in 70 AD. Iron-fisted as they are, their punishments for revolts were very, very severe. And it has not been rebuilt since. There was an attempt in 361, but due to a mysterious earthquake, the attempt was called off. But the huge ashlar blocks that make up the Temple Mount, the temple platform, still survive today, and some of them even surpass the size of the blocks used in the construction of the pyramids of Giza. This was a major undertaking. And these awe-inspiring ashlar blocks are now referred to as the Western Wall, which serve as this sort of solemn site where Jews of the world gather to lament and submit written prayers, which they insert between the stones and into the cracks of the original Temple Mount. The building you'll see now on top of the Temple Mount today is the Dome of the Rock, a Muslim shrine, and we're going to talk about it in a few classes, but it was added in the 7th century in the late 600s.